My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, get off my land! It's where the wheat grows tall.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Where the Wheat Grows Tall is a 44-page adventure by Camilla Greer and Evelyn Moreau, with layout by Die Sugars, published in 2021. From the text, upon which it is agreed, an old stone wall separates the family farm from a field they say is cursed. Deep within the wheat, two forgotten idols once balanced the spirits of the crops. One has been destroyed, and balance is gone. The Noon Lady rises, and the crop spirits grow cruel. The Polotnikovs have disappeared into the field, and their farm is soon to follow.
As for the actual contents of the module, it begins with a section called The Polotnikovs and Their Disappearance, wherein we learn about each member of the Polotnikov family and what happened to them after the balance was disrupted in the wheat field on the other side of that old stone wall. Essentially, they have either gone missing or are in hiding, and some of them are currently in brutal thrall to the Noon Lady. Then we have a section called The Sisters, where we learn about the Noon Lady and her counterpart, the Midnight Maiden, two fae spirits that hold sway in the wheat field, though the Noon Lady is currently ascendant. From there, we have a section called Running the Adventure, which contains hooks, rumors, and other advice, including what to do if the players decide to burn down the cursed wheat field. Spoiler, doing so will send some vengeful spirits their way. Then we have an encounter table divided into daytime, nighttime, and underground. That's followed by a bestiary, including 14 original monsters. Next is a more detailed history of the Polotnikov family, how they came to live on the land, and how their ancestors were the ones who originally invited these fae beings onto their land. Next comes the farm, which has 6 keyed locations, and then the remainder of the text is the wheat field itself, which is on the other side of the wall, which has 14 more keyed locations. There's also a 2-page map of the farm and field in the center of the book. Let's talk about how we have used this before in our gaming. Tom?
Well, I have not. I've only read it, but fortunately you have, right?
I have indeed. I ran it in 3 3-hour sessions using Trophy Gold, though one of those sessions was just the lead up to the adventure and just touched on the history and folklore of the area. So practically speaking, it was about 2 sessions, I think. Things we liked about Where the Wheat Grows Tall. Why don't we do this sort of production values and visual type stuff first?
Yeah.
The production values are very good. Everything is laid out really nicely. Everything is in a logical order. It's very easy to find things. I was working off of a PDF, but I've seen the physical product in pictures, and it's very pretty. It has this like deep green and gold. I don't think it's embossed, but it kind of looks like it's gold embossed cover. It feels a little fancier than like your typical zine, and that's what this is. This is a zine module. So it just sort of looks great.
The actual text, of course, being a D&D adventure, effectively, it can't maintain the illusion completely, but when you first look at it and you first start reading, it really feels like something you might have picked up at a secondhand bookstore and it was published in the 1930s or something. Particularly, it reminds me of a copy I got of Land of the Pointed Firs by Sarah Jewett, I think. Anyway, it's that kind of old style green and gold covers, yeah, and then woodcut-ish artwork, I guess. The fonts are all right. Are all correct. Not all right as in okay. And then the contents page, even that intro that I read at the beginning, it just really sells the sense of it being a period piece really well.
Yeah, let's talk about the artwork. Evelyn's artwork is terrific. In the interest of full disclosure, I should probably say here that I have worked with Evelyn Moreau on some projects in the past, though it was a few years ago. But with that out of the way, I think that Evelyn's style, which is quite whimsical, is a pretty good fit for this story. The story has a very strong fairy tale, folk magic vibe. Like you said, that sort of woodcut-ish artwork is a really good fit. And in particular, I think the whimsy of the illustrations is great because it sort of subverts the basic horror of the scenario and some of the scenes. There's one scene in particular of this character, Nikolai, who's the oldest Polotnikov's son, and he's attached to this plow, and he's madly in love with serving the Noon Lady, and he's in this plow, and he's described as like sunburnt and panting and raving mad, and it's just this sort of like really scary scene. But there's something about the artwork. The artwork has this like levity to it and this whimsy to it that I think it almost makes it feel ironic, and it actually makes the horror of it come out to me.
You're right. It also has something in common with fairy tales as they're recorded, that sort of zoomed out thing where a tale might say, and then the tailor was driven mad by his broken heart and he smashed everything and he struck people with stones and he ran around the town. And that would actually be terrifying if it was described in any real detail. Yeah. But, it just sort of moves swiftly past the essentials. And I guess they're kind of doing something there as well. The style is a bit, because it's not exactly woodcuts, that's the thing. It is hand-drawn line art. So it's a little bit like a period etching, but also a little bit like Astrid Lindgren Norwegian children's book style, which is, I think it's just the right pitch. Like you're right. It gives you that little bit of ironic distance. And then in a quiet moment, maybe when your character's not the focus of the action right now, you can think a little bit more about what that scene means and maybe scare yourself if you're so inclined to.
Definitely. I also like that, just sticking with the illustrations for a bit, I like that pretty much everything mentioned in the text has an illustration. There's very, very little that is not drawn. And that's not something I hold modules to as a general matter. It's unfair to expect everything to be illustrated. But this is a fairly brief module. It's 44 pages, but they're pretty spaced out pages. And given that, I think it was a nice choice to illustrate practically everything. I want to slide into the writing and the presentation of the information a bit.
Yeah.
I found this to be the case when I read it. It's especially the case running it, which is the creators have displayed a lot of good instincts about how this module is going to be used in play. I do have one little minor caveat there, which I'll cover in the questions portion, but in general, I found the writing to be very direct. It's very direct and gives you everything you need. Everything is organized to be found very easily, to the point of actually repeating certain entries where it would be helpful to have that information again, maybe like slightly changed for the context of the moment, but you get a few entries like multiple times because that's where it would be handy to have it.
Right, yeah.
The inclusion of how to adjust the adventure for a one-shot, or if you're running out of time, I thought was really great and kind of speaks to this idea of anticipating how the module could be used. The little bit that I mentioned in the opening crawl, what will happen if the players just try to burn the field down? I get the impression that happened.
It must have, yeah. That's a classic. It's definitely happened in playtesting, yeah.
Yeah. And also, one other thing that really shines in play and comes across to me as a real coup in terms of how the story is presented, which is the fact that in the wheat field, time is weird. And so it can suddenly be day or suddenly be night. And this is really, really helpful because certain things function really differently at night than they do in the day, certain monsters or certain encounters. And we talked an episode or two ago about the busybody player characters who maybe want to get everything knocked out really fast. You could theoretically just go to the wheat field and in a couple of hours knock out the whole thing, and it's only ever daytime and you just get to see the daytime stuff. But because time is unstuck and warps around and stuff and is weird, it can just suddenly be nighttime, and so you get to do some of the nighttime stuff too as well. I found that really enjoyable in play. I felt like I was getting the full experience because of that, which was terrific.
Yeah, that's nice. I wonder how deliberate that was as like a GM flexibility tactic, or whether it's because part of the vibe is the weird time in the fields.
Well, in any case, it didn't matter. It may have been either or both, but like it still comes off as believable.
Yeah, exactly. Regardless of the starting point, the end point is good, and it does have that comprehensive feel. I did find reading through, normally when I am reading something for the podcast that I haven't run, I find at least a couple of places in an adventure where I think, oh, hang on, I have to flip back to something in the introduction to double check what this refers to. That didn't happen here. Like you say, like there's always everything you need is right there, either in that paragraph or on the facing page. Good layout. And in terms of comprehensiveness, I love that double page map of the farm and the field. Just everything is there, nicely presented for you. You've got a whole mini setting. This is everything you need for your however many sessions, 2 and a bit, I guess it was for you, right?
Well, you mentioned that map. It's sort of everything you need. What I think is so great is there's an emphasis in the module on the history of the land, both the history of the Plotnikov family and also this history about a war that took place at some point that crossed over the wheat field. And so it has this rich lore and history that's baked into it. But what's great about it is we just get like the good parts. We just get the bits that are worth worrying about.
Yeah.
We have some soldier ghosts. We have some leftover remnants of the war. But truly, we have the central story between the two sisters, these fae spirits. And we've got fae creatures. We've got a little bit of the history of the Plotnikov family. And there's like an encounter that speaks to one of those things. Like every time you go somewhere, you're getting a little bit of that stuff. It's like, here's all this lore, and now here's the greatest hits of it in the dungeon, which I really appreciated. I thought that was very, very enjoyable. I think there's a version of this where some of that stuff is like just sort of buried in the background and maybe doesn't come to the fore so much, which might have been good as well. But I like that there are some big highlight, bright-lined moments in this that are meant to let you have the full experience of its little setting, which I think is great. Speaking of history and things, and also how things are presented, I want to talk a little bit about this section that's about the Plotnikov family and their history. The family history is important to understand because you need to understand like how these fae creatures entered the land. And long story short, essentially the older Plotnikov women knew hedge magic and brought them on the land. But then the fae, they started to regret that at a certain point, and so they walled up the field. In any case, you don't need to understand much about the history, and as a result, it's presented to you in a basic way that just gives you just the basics. You get like 2 basic sections. There's like a bulleted timeline of events, and there's a family tree. I found it really easy to work with, and I think that's what you want. We have played and covered other modules in the past where the history of the place is important, but the authors like really dwell on it. They dwell on it forever in the text, and then they actually bury it or make it hard to find in the dungeon itself or the adventure itself. Or it's just like set dressing that's just for the GM's entertainment.
Yeah. Whereas this one I like in the sense that the timeline that is, the actual dates are not that important, and then the family tree, that's all about, well, people's relationships, literally. So it's the way people think about their family history. So if an NPC were to tell you about the backstory, you could probably just paraphrase your way through that timeline, and if you see what I mean, and deliver it like that. It's not like I've recently been running a Call of Cthulhu adventure. It's pretty good. It's very good central conceit, which I can't even mention because it's so spoilery. But it's got a little timeline of the events of the past 9 days. And every so often I have to say to the players, bear with me while I check what date that happened.
Yeah.
But that's not how people remember things and tell you. They go like,
exactly.
Oh yeah, back when before my grandma had married my granddad, she worked at this place. And then that's how they relate things. And that is all you need to make sense of the present situation in most role-playing scenarios, I would say. So,
and especially this one, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is particularly the case in where the Wheat Grows Tall. I do think that the core puzzle or problem, I suppose, however we want to characterize it, the thing going on in the adventure, which is this enchanted wheat field being out of balance because you have these 2 idols and one of them is broken. The Midnight Maiden's idol is broken, therefore allowing the Noon Lady to dominate. There's a sort of like core problem that the characters have to contend with at a certain point, which is, do we raise the idol again in order to restore the balance? Or do we do the work of this witch character who wants to destroy the idol completely in order to free the Midnight Maiden from it? But that would cause the wheat field to stay out of balance. And that unfurling as the players start to come to an understanding about what's happening here is very enjoyable. I have a question about it in a bit, but I do want to just say at the outset that the underlying, I guess puzzle is the right way of characterizing it, the thing they have to suss out and figure out how to handle, is very enjoyable and very good. Once they start to interact with that part of it, it takes what was previously a timey-wimey, fae-infused, dreamy situation and really focuses it into this problem to be solved, and it felt like a good transition.
And it's very hard, actually, to come up with that kind of good dilemma. A lot of the time, the resolution is, here's the problem. Something's out of balance, and the question is, can we roll well enough on our skill checks and fight off the goblins in order to restore the previous situation? But here, where you actually have to decide which is the good thing for us to do, is there any way to do both at the same time? Which normally the answer is no, as I believe Spider-Man found out. So it's actually quite hard to do and to sell well, and I think this adventure does a good job on that front.
My last thing about things I liked, I think that the Bestiary, which is all inspired by Russian and Slavic folklore, feels pretty well researched. I didn't really look into it too deeply.
Yeah, it does. I'm also, all of the Slavic folklore I know has been learned either through or for role-playing games, so therefore I'm in a not particularly expert position either. But yeah, it feels right, and it feels like this. Obviously, there's more folklore in Slavic culture than this, and I think they've picked the correct subset. Like they all go together, They sort of feel like they complement each other well.
One of the things that I always feel a little bad about, because I run these things in Trophy Gold, and in Trophy Gold, per the rules, you can't speak the name of the monster. The players have to name it, and so we didn't really get to do all of that Russian Slavic folklore angle in our adventure because they got to name the monsters whatever the hell they wanted to name them, right? After they encountered them. But that's just a Trophy Gold wrinkle, but not a big deal.
But
ultimately.
Hey, it's more enculturated because, Russians don't think they're giving unusually Russian names to things. They just name stuff.
Exactly, right, yeah.
Exactly.
To them, it's just like small goblin or whatever, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, do you have anything else you want to say?
No, I think we covered everything in the things we liked, yeah.
Let's go to questions then. I think our questions are related, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, mine is just because we're probably going to skip over it, but I'd like just let the record show that this is one of those adventures where I found it's hard to visualize the likely through lines that players would take in it. So I was just going to ask what happened in your session, but I suspect you're going to tell us in your question. So let's see.
Yeah. So basically, I mentioned earlier the puzzle or problem that the players eventually have to face, like what to do about the wheat field and the balance of power and all that stuff. It's very enjoyable to watch the players do it. However, as the GM, you also have to piece it together in the text. It is not explicitly laid out for you as the GM. And frankly, if you're not reading it super closely, you might miss, especially in the section with the one-eyed witch, who is causing ultimately sort of the root of all these problems. If you're not careful reading that section, you won't pick up on the subtlety and the nuance of the situation. It's not hard. You will pick up on it, but would it have been better if the creators had just put a one-line sentence that says, this is what the witch wants and this is what the problem is? Or is there something about the GM having to figure it out that's important to the process?
See, I wonder about this because in general, I think, that you should just say what the thing is. But having said that, of course, one of my favourite scenarios is The Secret of Castronegro, which does not tell you what actually happened to the missing people and lets you figure it out. So I think I have a sort of cowardly hedged answer to this, which is that as long as it's, without wanting to denigrate this adventure or Castronegro, a simple enough situation that the writer is pretty sure in play you'll figure it out.
I think that's right.
Then I think it's okay. If it's like a 92-page multi-section adventure, you shouldn't do that. But I think in this size, you're going to get to it. I'm pretty sure the first time I ran Castronegro, when you find the spectacles at the place, he said, trying not to give too much away, I don't think I'd figured it out until then in the game. And I went, oh, right, now I know. Now I know what's going on. I was like 13. Give me a break. But and I think if you missed it in this, you probably would do the same kind of thing. You'd get to the scene and you'd figure it out.
I think that's the answer because it is a fairly direct, light module that you would just stumble on it as you sort of, as long as you're like presenting things as they're meant to be presented according to the text, you would probably get there. Anyway, it's a fairly minor quibble. I don't think it didn't really affect anything in our game at all. But to kind of get back to your question, which was, it's hard to see the through lines. I think that's right. And I think that's on purpose. There are things that the players can just ignore in the farm portion. And if they ignore them, there are key things they're going to miss, but it doesn't all hang on that. I don't think it really matters. If you don't learn about the granary and all the grain that you can go turn into a business or whatever, I don't think that's as important, but it's a cool detail, but I don't think it's something that's going to break anything. Once you get on the other side of the wall into the enchanted wheat field, things are really wide open then because you can kind of go anywhere and take different paths, or you can cut through the wheat and encounter things in pretty much any order that you want. And that's what happened in our game. I kind of thought they would do X, but they did Y, and it didn't really matter at the end of the day. It all sort of held together. It helps that Trophy Gold has set goals that focus the players' attention and what they want to do and what they want to accomplish. But I found it to be okay. It was fun just to follow it around and see what happened.
Yeah, I suspected that would be the case. My question wasn't because it's the kind of text where you read it and think, what even happens in this adventure, or what do they do? But rather it's just, I don't know, sometimes you read a thing and you immediately are picturing in your head what you think how it would turn out. And this one I was just like, well, this seems good, but I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm just on bad visualizing form this week and I can't do it.
Yeah, I think you would probably be okay with it. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Tom.
There is a page called, I think, Farm Implements as Weapons. It consists of an entire page of different to scale sketched sickles and hoes and whatnot with their damage they do written next to them. I loved this kind of layout when I saw it in the Filipino Merkborg scenario Bones of Pathala. I love it here, and I will steal it for my own games as well.
The adventure hooks are simple and terrific. I use the one about the buried soldier's treasure in my game, but all of them are very easy entrees into the adventure.
I like this random daytime encounter that has been mentioned already in this episode of the podcast, namely, Nikolai, yoked to a plough, wandering the field, sunburnt and delirious, with love for the noon lady.
You can crawl underground, and one of the traps is described as humongous stalacturnips with writhing roots that stretch your fingers when eaten.
I like this item you might find in the witch's cottage. I think that's where it is. On the mantelpiece, there is a snoring mandragore under a bell jar. It wakes loudly if disturbed, and you suffer 1d6 damage if you don't make your save. And then it falls very soundly back to sleep.
And speaking of turnip-based fauna, we have Turnip Jack, which stands out as a very terrific monster in an already terrific bestiary. It's basically a big turnip man whose magical lantern steals your light. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Our topic today is folk horror in tabletop role-playing games. What makes it folk horror? What makes it different from other types of horror? And how can you introduce that particular vibe and aesthetic into your gaming or your game writing? I want to say at the outset that a couple of things. One, I want to recommend 2 other episodes we have done of this show that have related expert delve topics. Prison of the Hated Pretender has a topic on daylight dungeoneering and a subtopic that's of particular interest here, which is called Full Daylight Horror. And then our Winter's Daughter episode talks about fairy tale elements in tabletop role-playing games, which is a connected genre and idea with this. I also want to add that I'm not even 100% sure that Where the Wheat Grows Tall is strictly folk horror. I think it's probably more accurately described as a dark fairy tale type story, but I think it has enough folk horror elements in it to justify doing this topic. So
Yeah,
let's kind of go with that.
all that's required, yeah. To be fair, though, folk horror is a fairly broad genre. Like, if you
It is,
think about
yeah.
it, like, I think the 2 keystone, it's a relatively recently named one as well. I think it's The Wicker Man and I want to say Witchfinder General. Is that the other one that people mention for the folk horror genre? So yeah, I was trying to think about how to define it and maybe say some ideas now, and you can tell me if you agree, Jason.
Yeah, give us your definition.
Okay, I think the story needs to be 3 key things. It must be rustic, simple, with some caveats on what that means, and ancient.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
These are some important things. Now, of course, yeah, some of these are not necessarily true as well. And I think you could arguably have urban folk horror because, of course, folklore is a thing that exists everywhere. But it would still have to be, I would say, related to the land.
Yes.
And to oldness and notions of old and new and things like that. I would also, I think another thing that is important is that there are kind of 2 aspects to folk horror, right? There's what I'm going to call insider horror.
Okay.
So this is where you think you know what's going on as the protagonist, but things actually are not what you thought they were like. So I'm going to summarize this as classist H.P. Lovecraft instead of racist H.P. Lovecraft. So it's the ones
Right.
where he encounters poor white people and they turn out to have hideous secrets. So like the protagonist could be part of the community, like maybe you're from this village and you discover the other villagers are doing weird things. But maybe not. They could just be of the same kind. I don't know. Let's make it a 1970s British one. So you're driving from London up to Liverpool and you pull over in a small village to fix your car or something. And so you expect that everything is going to be the same as elsewhere in the country, but it's not. For example, like if someone in a film were to travel from Mexico to the mountains of Java, that's not folk horror. That's the outsider others horror genre. If they travel from Jakarta to the mountains of Java, that is potentially a folk horror setup.
Yeah, I love it. That's really great. I've never thought about it that way, but I like it. This idea of the protagonist is a quote-unquote insider in some way. They have an expectation about what they're going to find, and the defying of that expectation is what makes it scary. I was thinking actually of, in very, very recent times, the movie Midsommar is considered like the gold standard of folk horror. Midsommar, this idea applies, even though the protagonists are from the United States and not Sweden, because there is a cultural expectation there, because they're both Western civilization, right? They're both like Western cultures. I remember watching the movie, and maybe this is just internal biases or whatever, but I remember thinking to myself, well, how can this be scary? It's Sweden. Like, yes. I literally thought that. I was like, well, it's fucking Sweden. It can't be that scary. We know what to expect. It's a Western culture. I buy role-playing games from Sweden. Like, how bad can it be? But it's the defying of that expectation. It's like when they get there, and these cultural insiders are definitely outsiders. And that's true of the audience as well. You are a cultural outsider, as it turns out. Yeah. Or like, you're a cultural insider who's having their expectations defied. That feels like a really important part of this. I think you're right. I
think it is, yeah. It's that sort of that paranoid horror. Like, you discover that for your whole life, everyone around you has been telepathic, except for you, and they knew about it, that kind of thing. Actually, I want to give an example of mild folk horror from real life, which is, oddly enough, the audio tour at Stonehenge. So if you ever get a chance to go, do take the audio tour. They package it with the ticket to get in, because I think they assume people wouldn't listen otherwise. And I almost didn't bother, right? I was just going to go, like, I don't want someone in my ears telling me stuff about Stonehenge. Right, yeah. I'm just going to go look at it. But I'm glad I did, because what it does is, it makes you walk around the circle, and it tells you about different stones and where they may have come from, the heel stone and the alignment of the sun and whatnot. But then it spends about half the time getting you to turn around and face away from the circle and look at the countryside around you. Now, Salisbury Plain is pretty flat, but it has these gently sloped rolling hills here and there. But what you gradually realize as this voice talks to you about those hills is that one over there, that's not a real hill. That is a barrow that was constructed thousands of years ago to bury someone. And it's got smooth over the time, but it's artificial. And that one you're looking at over there, so is that. And in fact, you are not surrounded by what you thought were natural hills.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
You're in a graveyard, basically.
You're in a fucking graveyard. Yeah, it's great.
And the slow realization of that is something to do with the essence of this part of folk horror.
Yeah, I love it. Let's move on to your other big idea. Yeah. Your two big ideas. One was outsider fear.
Yeah, so then there's the sort of fear of outsiders, but it's not like racist H.P. Lovecraft outsider fear. It's those things out on the moors. The idea that there are things that are a good reason for you to stay inside at night.
Wait, for clarification, we're talking about, from my vantage point as a member of the community, the outsider is the thing outside of that community that I fear?
The monster that's in the woods or on the out in the mountains or so on. So like if you've got what you could call a closed landscape, so maybe narrow valleys and forests, what you're afraid of is there is too many things. There's too many tree trunks. You can't see what might be lurking. And when you're in open land, like where I grew up, you do feel sometimes, especially when it's just after sunset, this feeling of real loneliness. Now, you could probably see anyone that was approaching you from miles around. It's really flat where I grew up. But the fact is, if there was someone nearby or something happened to you, there's no one around to help you. You can shout as much as you like. It's that feeling of isolation. And I think what's key to both of these landscapes feelings, and in the sort of stories that you would hear, again, when I grew up in like East Anglia, is that the threats are sometimes a bit ambivalent. Like around our way, we had what was called fairly prosaically the black dog, right? Which is, I think it's called black shuck up north sometimes. And it's this just a big black dog that is said to attack men who are alone, but sometimes protects women and children and walks them back to their home and then leaves them once they're in sight of home. I think a common thing is this idea that there's the monster, but it can also sometimes help you. You know, the witch in the cave who can give you potions that will do stuff that you want, but is also a witch in a cave. And so a thing that you sometimes see in folk horror reasonably often is this idea that the characters are actually approaching the monster because they want something from it.
That makes great sense. And if you think about it, one of the things that makes folk horror what it is this idea of community and the isolation of that community. And we think about like ideas of community. In some ways, the black dog or the local witch that might give you potions if you approach her correctly, it's almost like saying they're ours. It's like they're part. Yes, it's scary, but they're part of the community. They're ours. At the end of the day, you're coming here. You're here in our place. And that's our scary black dog.
Yeah.
Right? You know,
Yeah.
like we understand how to deal with it. We know
Yeah.
what to look out for.
Yeah.
That feels like an important part of it. That's very, very interesting. I love it. For me, when I think about definitions, I suppose, the most obvious thing is there has to be a connection to local folklore. That seems pretty straightforward. I imagine rural or agrarian settings, like you said, simple, rustic. I think that's the idea. Isolated community. A very specific, I don't know if it's like a requirement, but something that we see a lot in folk horror standards or like big folk horror things that we're all aware of, like The Wicker Man, for example, or Midsommar, is this idea of the community having pagan beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Pagan beliefs tend to be a big thing in this type of fiction. And I think themes related to the dark power of nature, or showing how an otherwise bucolic place has this dark underbelly. That feels like a really important part of it too. The juxtaposition between the full daylight and the dark feels like an important part of the genre to me. You know, I'm just sort of rephrasing what you just said, but in terms of definitions, that feels like right. Like you said, it's a wide genre, so wide that Where the Wheat Grows Tall is probably not even strictly folk horror, but it's close enough, right? Because it has so many of these elements.
It's there or thereabouts. I mean, it probably, if it isn't, that's probably because in the OSRE fantasy genre that we presume we're playing in, the protagonists are going to show up and they're pretty powerful in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if they were a newlywed couple driving cross country, then I think that would be fairly safely in folk horror territory. Oh, one note I do want to make though is I think you're definitely right about the pagan practices thing. That's really I don't know if it's mandatory, but it feels like it. But it's notable that quite often there's no real supernatural thing going on. And it's also quite often not really ancient practices, like the Wicker Man, right? They, on that island, they haven't been doing that pagan stuff for very long in the story. And nothing really magic happens. A guy just gets, spoiler alert, burnt in a Wicker Man. It's just like, and like if Children of the Stones, which I'll mention in Companion Adventures later, minor spoiler alert, sort of goes a bit sci-fi after about 6 episodes as well. So it's like, it's those trappings of the rural community. And I think there is something to the idea of ancient practices and things being thought dead that actually are alive. I do think that's important, but it might be one you can skip on your checklist, perhaps, if you're writing a folk horror adventure, for example. But I'm not sure. It's really hard to say.
Children of the Corn, which is not a great movie, if I'm being honest. It's got its moments, but probably one of the better or most noteworthy examples of American folk horror. The stuff that's happening in that town, where it's basically these kids, they get dedicated to like a dark god, basically, and they start murdering the adults. Those events are very new, very fresh, like it's just happening. And it's only supernatural in like the last 5 minutes or so. It's not really like a supernatural thing for most of the movie. There's like some touches of the supernatural here and there, but for the most part, it's just like crazy kids murdering people in this Nebraskan cornfield. So yeah, so that kind of makes sense. I think the ancientness and the supernaturalness are not requisite, but they really do come out a lot in some of these things.
Yeah, so, I mean, you might as well start there, I suppose.
Yeah, start there, essentially. Why don't we transition over to role-playing games? You know, this is a show about role-playing games. That's what we do here. And with all these definitions and discussion about what is folk horror out of the way, a question I have that I think we should ponder here is, how is this not just every adventure module that starts out in a village or a farm?
Well, that's a great question. And I think quite a lot of the classic ones maybe are a bit folk horror. Like you think about Cult of the Reptile God that's got something lurking in the swamp that's kidnapping people from the village. You know, we talked about the central dilemma in Where the Wheat Grows Tall. I think that's something that's key to the horror thing, because you don't want to deprotagonize your fireball slinging wizard characters, but at the same time, things that are scary for the average civilian are not that scary for them. But having to make this irrevocable choice between one bad thing and another bad thing, that I think is scary. That maybe is the value of having that, because even a 12th level whatever is going to have to agonize over that and still suffer the consequences of whichever one they choose.
I think for an adventure module to be folk horror, it has to first be horror. I have expressed on this very show before that I think all dungeons and adventures are sort of intrinsically horrifying, but they are not necessarily the genre of horror. I think like the genre of horror probably has to be taking place in the module for It, as a threshold matter to possibly be considered folk horror vibes and aesthetic, seems obvious, but Something Stinks in Stilton, for example, feels like folk horror to me in a lot of ways. It has a fantasy adventure world's version of a story, of a tale. It involves cows and dairy and an agrarian setting. But importantly, it's really fucking scary. The way you interact with that adventure is through its murders. It's creeping around in dark places. It's like killers. It's got that horror to it, which I think that's probably, we compare it to something like your average D&D adventure that starts out in a village. I think that's the difference, right? Like, I think it has to be scary as a threshold.
Yeah, and there is violence in Stilton, but there are no fight scenes.
Precisely. Yeah. In a fantasy game, you can't help but trip over folktales.
Yeah.
But I think for our purposes, if you're trying to capture a folk horror vibe in your fantasy adventure module, sort of what you were saying earlier, Tom, the folk tale aspect of it needs to be central to what the adventurers are doing. It can't just be in the background. It has to be centered on that. Like, if there is a monster that the folk tale is connected to, that monster and dealing with a monster needs to be the primary activity. If we think about like the backstory of Where the Wheat Grows Tall or Wet Grandpa, that local legend of the area, in those two modules, you are interacting directly with that local legend and dealing with the consequences of it and interacting with the characters connected to it. That feels like an important part of it. You can imagine, of course, just any other adventures where like there is all these legends and these folk tales in the area, but the main thing you're doing is chasing off orcs or fighting a dragon, right? Like it's different.
You don't want a random encounter with a just walking wicker man in the forest. Although, by the way, that would be an amazing monster. Just a big burning wicker man walking around the forest.
With a person in it. Screaming.
Yeah. But also controlling it or something. Yeah.
Horrifying pagan mech or something.
But you're right. That's if you think about Wet Grandpa, like the whole point is you move into the area of the adventure where the legends exist, or the tale. You hear the tales first, Dark Depths style. You hear about what's happened, then you gradually approach it and you see it for yourself. If instead you just stumbled into those weird river mermaids' lair by accident and picked up some of their treasure and then fought one of them and ran away, that's not folk horror because you don't have the build-up of the foreboding. So that's why it's something that you can't do purely improvisationally, because you have to seed that build-up and show that at least other people are afraid of these things or are very emotionally invested in these things in a strange way, even if your characters are not.
I also think that there's just an aesthetic consideration that has to take place.
Oh, yeah. Like, I mean, you got to ditch the goblins. Like,
ditch the orcs, ditch the dragons. It's got to be agrarian. It's got to be natural. It's got to be wolves. It's got to be fey creatures. It's got to be scarecrows. You've got to be dealing with challenges related to woods and rivers and angry harvest gods. That aesthetic is probably going to do most of the work, I think. Yeah. The central activities should be connected to those things as well. Anything else you want to say about folk horror, or specifically folk horror in role-playing games?
Not really, although actually I just want to clarify, I side-mentioned Dark Depths there. That's Graham Walmsley's blueprint for horror adventures, and it applies to folk horror at least as well as to any other subgenre. So I think it's Googleable. I'm not sure if it's actively published anymore.
It's terrific. I've created a whole business based off it. So.
Yes.
So, it's lovely. I think he's disavowed it, hasn't he? I don't know.
Well, I don't think he's abjures it entirely, but it's not the state of the art as far as Graham's concerned.
Yeah. Let's go to the next segment. It's the companion adventures. There are a lot of really obvious choices here.
Yeah, I think, can I just say congratulations to us for not immediately just listing the Wicker Man at the top of both our lists. Yeah.
There are loads of obvious choices here. We've covered probably a lot of them in previous episodes, but let's talk about role-playing game stuff. Linda Kodega, who I'll mention here, goes by pronouns they, them. Linda wrote an article for Dicebreaker, which has a good overview of some role-playing games inspired by folklore from non-Western cultures. So if you're looking for role-playing games, folklore, and folk horror, non-Western, this piece on Dicebreaker is great. I have every confidence we're going to include a link to it in the show notes. So
let's do that. Yeah.
So definitely go check out their article on Dicebreaker. And did you have a role-playing game thing as well?
I do. I should do just a mandatory mention for Mark Galeotti's Mythic Russia, which is a whole standalone game set in, I want to say 13th century Russia, but I'm not sure. But at any rate, it's packed full of Slavic, well, Russian specifically, but broadly Slavic folklore, as well as knights errant and what have you. So definitely go and check that out if you want to have a game-statted but lucid primer on the topic of the kind of folklore that appears in Where the Wheat Grows Tall.
Mm-hmm. Shudder, my favorite streaming service, which is a horror movie and horror genre streaming service. They curate a pretty nice list of folk horror movies. The current list is very Western in flavor: Wicker Man, Children of the Corn, A Field in England, that kind of thing. But they have a pretty extensive collection of international horror movies in general. And that's particularly relevant for our purposes here because so much international horror, especially stuff from Southeast Asia, for example, deals with folklore. Folklore is a big, big focus. My recommendation here is going to be Satan's Slave, which is an Indonesian classic from 1982. I only got a chance to see it when it hit Shudder because it was very hard to find before that, actually. And interestingly, Shudder actually made a 2017 Shudder original remake of Satan's Slave. I have not seen that yet, though.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I've never seen Satan's Slave. People talk about it a lot in Indonesia for film history reasons. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of Indo horror, especially from the, I want to say 70s, like really lurid stuff as well, frequently.
Yeah. I get the impression that Satan's Slave was pretty influential on the scene.
Yeah.
Because it seems like there's other movies that kind of followed it that have a lot of really similar vibe.
For film, I've got Caliber from 2018, which is, I think it's not marketed as horror because, without doing any spoilers, it doesn't really have any monsters in it. It's not pitched like a horror film, but it is horrific. It's about these two guys who go hunting in an isolated rural community in the Scottish Highlands, which, setup's pretty standard. It's during the wrong time of the year to do it, like heavy rainfall, and the tourist trade has been dwindling for various reasons, so all the locals are disaffected and surly. Basically, these two guys are not supposed to go out hunting without a guide, and they don't bother waiting for one to be available, and terrible things occur afterwards, and it becomes increasingly harrowing. Yeah, technically I think it would be called a psychological thriller or something, but there are so many beats that are horror movie stuff. Trying to drive away in your Land Rover, then the car breaks down, you have to get out and go through the woods on foot while being pursued, all this kind of thing. And good isolated rural terror on that front.
It just occurs to me that, is it American Werewolf in London, the one where the two Americans are in the English village?
Now, I was thinking about this one. American
Is
Werewolf
that
in
a folk horror? I think it is.
No, I think I was thinking, is folk horror possible in an urban setting?
But it's only urban for like part of it, though.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think the beginning bit with, by the way, British comedy fans, Rick Mayall is in that scene in the pub at the beginning in the background, if you pay attention. Yeah, that bit at the beginning with, stay on the path, sir, stay on the path. That's classic folk horror. Yeah. And then, of course, it sort of takes a left turn into John Landis land, but I think the first part of it. Yeah, the
first part of it is a good.
And actually, it's probably a good model for role playing games in some ways, which is that you maybe don't want to spend all your time in a folk horror village, but if you deal with the initial encounter, you can then have things follow the characters to the next city they show up in, and
consequences.
So on, in a fun way, yeah.
You have a TV bit, yeah?
Yeah, I do. I want to mention this. So, Children of the Stones was again, much talked about ITV show from the 70s, made for children, but as the comedian Stuart Lee described it, the most horrific thing that's ever been made for children. And it's about this kid who, and I only saw it like quite recently for the first time, this kid who moves to a village with his father, who is an archaeologist stroke rock scientist guy, to study the standing stone circle that is around the village. And of course, they discover that some of the villagers, most of them even, are in this sort of weird, permanently emotionless state and just greet each other with the phrase, happy day, and so on. And it's great to watch because you can see that it's possible to create really good tension, even if the actual presentation and acting is a little ham-handed. And I also discovered and listened to a BBC podcast adaptation from 2020, which sort of updates the plot to, I guess, 2020, pre-COVID. And I would say is arguably a bit better, sort of sticks the landing a little better in the last couple of episodes. So yeah, really check that out. I mean, it's pretty much pure folk horror. It's literally about standing stones, rituals that happen in them, these things coming back to haunt the world in the modern day.
All the greatest hits of folk horror,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
It's just running down the checklist and ticking off everything, basically, yeah.
I was trying to think of books and stories, and There are a couple dozen things I could have probably picked here, but I decided to go with something that is distinctly American because a lot of folk horror, especially English language folk horror, is very UK-centric. But The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, a short story from 1948, which I remember reading in high school and being very, very, mind blown by it. I thought it was really great.
Yeah.
I love The Lottery. I'm not going to say too much about it because it is I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but let's just say that it's Americana folk horror.
Yeah.
Has all the tropes of folk horror, but it has some really distinctly American themes in it. Playing with ideas of democracy and playing with ideas of hypocrisy and other themes. I don't want to go into it too much, but let's just say for a good taste of Americana folk horror.
Oh yeah, that's such a great call. I'm annoyed at myself for not thinking of it. So yeah, that's really good. I think you can read it on the New Yorker website as well. If I think it's still up there.
I think it's pretty generally available.
It's where it's published. So yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can follow The Gauntlet at Gauntlet RPG on Twitter. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. If you would like to support the show financially, you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you to our agrarian editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Wulin, our PBTA game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. Hearts of Wulin emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Wulin at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com.